I'm Nora Bennett, 29, and the Friday I'm about to tell you about began with a simple text from my mother, dinner at 6. Everyone's expected. I stared at those 4 words while the office lights flickered overhead and the rain pressed steady against the window, the kind of Portland drizzle that never quite stops. By 5:30, I was on the freeway heading toward the same 2-story house where I learned to ride a bike and learned to keep certain feelings quiet. The porch light glowed like a reminder, warm and unyielding, and for a moment, I sat in my car listening to the turn signal click. Inside, silverware would already be set, napkins folded just so, and my sister Lauren would be at the center of it all without even trying. I took a breath that felt heavier than it should and opened the door anyway, because that was what I'd always done. What I didn't know then was that this would be the last time I walked in as the person they expected me to be. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to find your voice at the worst possible moment. Tap that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. I grew up in the soft middle of a neighborhood that smelled like cut grass in summer and wood smoke in fall, in a home where thank you notes were written in blue ink and school pictures were lined up straight along the stairway wall. My parents believed in order and schedules posted on the fridge, in showing up for church, even when the rain slanted sideways. They believed in keeping your head down and your work neat. I learned to measure things time savings chances, while my sister learned to command a room, and it never seemed like either of us had chosen our roles, only that we wore them until they felt like skin. We were not rich, but we were never without the basics, and my parents carried that as a badge, careful about every dollar, careful about what the neighbors might think. Years later, when I took a job as a financial analyst near the harbor, I still carried their voice in my ear. Be responsible, be humble, don't make a fuss. The world I stepped into after college was nothing like the one I'd known. The office had glass walls and espresso machines that hissed like small trains, and people bought winter coats because they liked the cut, not because their old ones were worn through. I watched bonuses land in accounts with the soft click of a mouse, watched coworkers order takeout without checking the price, and I felt how far my careful math could stretch in a place like this. I rented a small apartment downtown that fit a narrow table, a couch that leaned toward comfortable, and a view of a brick wall that turned gold at sunset. It was enough, more than enough most days, but the contrast between my quiet space and the polished rooms my sister posted online pressed lightly on my ribs in a way I didn't talk about. At home, the rhythm never changed. Fridays meant a drive to the suburbs, the scent of garlic and butter drifting from the kitchen. The long wooden table dressed like company was always coming. My mother kept traditions the way some people keep jewelry polished, protected, worn only one way. My father told the same stories with the same pauses, where laughter was supposed to land, and Lauren, 3 years ahead, and always a step taller, let their pride wash over her like a warm lamp. I didn't mind sharing light. I minded how the beam rarely bent my way, how my good news seemed to fall between the floorboards while hers was lifted like a trophy. Still, I believed in the things I'd been taught. Keep your promises, do the work in front of you, take care of what you can. That belief made it easy to say yes when family needed a ride, a fix, a favor, and I kept saying yes long after the habit had a life of its own. The truth is, I liked being dependable. It felt steady in a world that shifted fast. But steadiness can turn into silence if you're not careful, and silence has a way of being mistaken for agreement. I told myself the small costs didn't matter, that love was measured in ordinary ways, that patience would be seen for what it was. As the years moved, my life began to take on edges I chose for myself. Early runs along the river helped me think straighter. A Thursday night cooking class gave me a reason to laugh with people who knew me only as Nora and not anyone's comparison point. And at work, I started noticing the subtle nods from my director when a project landed clean. It wasn't glory, but it was honest, and it fit me better than any spotlight would have. I could feel something quiet building, like a floor being laid under my feet, piece by piece, day by day, until I could stand taller without asking permission. And on that particular Friday, the day the rain wouldn't quit, I held that feeling close as I parked by the curb and shut off the engine. I wish I could say the knot in my stomach was just nerves, that it would pass with the first clatter of plates, but I knew better. As I walked toward the porch, I could see our neighbor Ruth waving through her window the way she always did, and I waved back, grateful for the simple kindness of being seen. The door opened to warmth and familiar voices, to my mother's apron and my father's grin and my sister's easy laugh, and for a breath it looked like every Friday I could remember. Then the room shifted almost imperceptibly, the way a picture tilts when a nail loosens, and I understood that something in me had moved and would not budge back. I took my seat where I always sat, unfolded my napkin and waited for dinner to begin, unaware of just how quickly the night would test everything I thought I knew. The smell of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the dining room as my mother carried the last dish to the table. The lights were bright, too bright, catching the polished surface of the old wooden table where every Friday dinner played out like a script. My father poured himself a glass of wine, nodding with satisfaction. My sister Lauren sat across from me, her hair brushed smooth, her gold bracelet catching the light as she reached for the salad bowl. It was one of those evenings where everything looked perfect from the outside, and yet something beneath the surface felt tightly wound. Dinner began the way it always did, with small talk about traffic work and weather. My mother asked Lauren about her firm's latest case, her tone brimming with admiration. My father leaned forward, adding questions about the clients, the court, the judge. They spoke of her as though she were a figure on the evening news, and I once again became the quiet listener at the far end of the table. When my mother turned to me, her smile softened politely. "And how's work at the harbor office, Nora?" she asked, her voice almost casual. I told her it was steady, that our team was closing the quarter strong. She nodded but didn't ask for details. The conversation turned back to Lauren's new house before my words had fully landed. It went on like that through the first course and into the main dish. My sister described the renovations she was planning, the new countertops, the guest suite for visiting partners from her firm. My father listened proudly, his chest lifted a little higher. "You deserve it," he said, and my mother echoed him softly. "You've worked so hard for everything you have." I sat there tasting the bitterness behind each bite, knowing that the house they were sitting in might not have stood at all if not for me. Still, I said nothing. I had made a promise to myself long ago to keep the peace, even when the peace left a bruise. After dessert, when the plates had been cleared and the sound of the dishwasher hummed faintly from the kitchen, my mother reached for her wine glass again. She studied me for a moment, her head slightly tilted. "You know Nora?" she began. "Lauren has always had such drive. She knows what she wants and goes after it. You could learn from that." Her voice wasn't cruel. It was soft, almost tender, and that made it worse. My fork froze midway to my plate. My father looked up from his glass, not in warning, but in agreement, as if she were simply stating a truth too obvious to dispute. The air grew thick, the kind of silence that fills a room after an insult disguised as advice. My mother continued, her tone measured and calm. "You've done well for yourself, dear, but you're not half the woman your sister is, and that's all right. People are different." The words struck cleanly without force, but they landed deep. My heart clenched, not in surprise but in recognition, as though it had been waiting years to hear what it already knew. My sister's eyes flickered toward me, sympathetic but quiet, her lips pressing into a faint line. She said nothing either. For a moment, all I could hear was the clock in the hall ticking. Then I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping against the hardwood. The sound cut through the stillness like a blade. I stood up slow but certain and met my mother's eyes. "Then let her pay the rent for you," I said. My voice came out even almost cold, but I could feel my pulse racing beneath it. The color drained from my father's face. He straightened in his chair, his hand tightening around his wine glass. "Rent," he repeated. "What rent?" That word echoed in my ears. The truth buried for 3 years came rising up all at once. "The mortgage," I said quietly. "The one I've been helping with since the pandemic. 36 transfers every month so you wouldn't lose this house." My mother's eyes widened. My father's mouth fell open, his expression caught between confusion and disbelief. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice suddenly hard. "You must be mistaken." I looked at him squarely. "I'm not. You called me that winter when Dad lost the construction contract. You said you couldn't cover the next payment, that the bank would send a notice if it didn't come in on time. I saw the flicker of memory in my mother's eyes before she blinked it away. We never asked you to do that, she said quickly, the denial sharp and trembling. If you chose to help, that was your decision. But don't bring it up now. Something in me broke open at that. You didn't ask, I said quietly. You cried on the phone. You said it was just this once. I turned to my father. And you promised you'd pay it back. My voice wavered, but I steadied it. You didn't. And I never asked you to. But tonight, after everything I've done, you still say I'm not half the woman my sister is. The room went still again. My father set down his glass and crossed his arms, trying to reclaim control. You're being inappropriate, he said. His tone clipped. This is not the place for that kind of talk. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Inappropriate, I asked. I sat here every week listening to the same praise, the same comparisons. I sent money that could have been my future, my own home, my education, and I never said a word. But tonight you tell me I'm not even half of her. My voice was shaking now, not from anger, but from the weight of finally saying what had been trapped for so long. Lauren shifted in her chair, her face pale. Nora, she started, but I lifted a hand. Don't, I said quietly. Not tonight. I looked back at my parents. You wanted to know what rent I was talking about? It's this house, the one I grew up in, the one that wouldn't be standing if I hadn't paid for it. My mother opened her mouth, but no sound came out. My father stared down at his plate, his shoulders rigid. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Then my mother drew a breath, her voice low. You're always too sensitive, she said. We never meant to hurt you. You just take things too personally. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw that she believed it. She didn't see how her words carved deeper than any argument could. You mean it's my fault, I said softly, for feeling what you say out loud. She didn't answer. Neither did my father. Lauren kept her eyes fixed on the tablecloth, the diamond on her ring catching the light as she fidgeted with her hands. I felt the tears gathering but refused to let them fall. Instead, I reached for my purse and placed it over my shoulder. I understand now, I said, each word steady. No matter what I do, it'll never be enough. I'll always be the one sitting in the corner, the one who gives quietly and stays invisible. I'm done. My father's chair scraped backward. If you leave this table, he said sharply, don't come back. His voice was rough, louder than he meant it to be, but it landed like a verdict. I nodded once without speaking and walked toward the front door. Behind me, I could hear my mother's breath catch a sound caught between shock and disbelief. The smell of rosemary and wine hung heavy in the air as I opened the door. The night outside was cold and damp, but the air felt cleaner than the room I had left. As I walked down the steps, the words echoed in my mind. You're not half the woman your sister is. I didn't look back. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and shining under the streetlights. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear a dog barking, a reminder that life continued beyond that house and its silence. I reached my car, started the engine, and sat there for a long moment with my hands on the steering wheel, the weight of 3 years pressing against my chest. The house behind me glowed softly through the curtains, a picture of warmth to anyone passing by. But inside those walls, something had cracked open that couldn't be put back. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, took a deep breath, and pulled away from the curb. As the road opened in front of me, the ache in my chest gave way to something sharper, something cleaner. I didn't know where this would lead yet, but I knew this much. I was done being silent. And as the city lights faded behind me, I could already feel the first edge of change waiting just beyond the next turn. The drive home that night felt longer than any I could remember. The city lights blurred through the rain on my windshield, and the sound of tires on wet pavement seemed to echo everything I hadn't said. When I reached my apartment, I didn't turn on the lights right away. The quiet settled around me, heavy and familiar, the kind that makes you hear your own heartbeat. I kicked off my shoes, sat at the small dining table by the window, and let the silence stretch until it hurt. The words from dinner replayed again and again. You're not half the woman your sister is. Each time they cut deeper. I opened my laptop more from instinct than purpose and signed into my bank account. The numbers were still there, every scheduled transfer, every line that showed the money I had sent on the 15th of each month, 36 payments all the same. I stared at them until the screen blurred, then clicked cancel. A message popped up asking if I was sure, and I pressed yes without hesitation. The confirmation window disappeared, leaving the page blank and still. The weight that lifted was sharp, almost painful, like a knot being pulled loose after years of tension. For a long time I sat motionless, the glow from the screen lighting the edges of the papers scattered around me. Then I opened the drawer beneath the table and pulled out the folder I had kept hidden for years. Inside were the printed statements, every transaction, every month, each one neatly filed. I spread them out, covering the table from end to end. Some months showed $500, others more than $1,000. I added them up on a notepad, my pencil moving in steady strokes until the final total stared back at me, $72,000. The sight of it made me draw a slow breath that trembled before it left my chest. That number should have been a down payment on my first home, maybe a small place with a balcony and enough light to grow herbs on the sill. It could have been graduate school or the security I had promised myself when I first started working. Instead, it was gone folded into a house that wasn't mine, a life I was never part of. I leaned back, eyes on the ceiling, trying to find steady ground in the thought that I couldn't get that time back. But as the minutes passed, another feeling began to rise underneath the ache. Something lighter, something that felt like air finally reaching my lungs. By the next morning, the city had cleared after the rain. I woke early, laced my running shoes, and stepped out into the mist along the river. The air was crisp, the kind that carried the scent of wet pine and coffee from the shops near the waterfront. I started slow, just moving my body, feeling the rhythm of my breath fall into place. The farther I ran, the easier it became to breathe. Each footfall on the pavement seemed to peel away a layer of heaviness I hadn't realized I was carrying. By the time I looped back toward home, my chest ached, but this time it wasn't from sadness. In the days that followed, I began changing the small things that had quietly kept me tethered to my old life. On Thursdays, I joined a cooking class at the community center near my apartment. The kitchen was bright and warm, filled with people who didn't know me as anyone's daughter or sister. There were retired teachers, young couples, and a handful of students who laughed easily when a dish went wrong. The first night, my sauce burned, and everyone teased me good-naturedly until I was laughing too. No one asked what I did for a living, and no one compared me to anyone else. It was the first time in years that I felt the simple joy of being seen without measure. Weekends became a time for something new. My coworker Julie invited me to join a small hiking group that explored the trails near Mount Hood. The first time I reached the summit, wind rushing past my face, the valley stretched wide below like an endless ocean of green. I stood there breathless and lightheaded, realizing how far away that dining room table felt now. Out there was no echo of judgment, no expectation waiting for me to fill a space I didn't fit. There was only the sound of the trees swaying and my heartbeat steadying to the rhythm of my own pace. Work changed too, though nothing about my job title or office did. With the silence at home no longer weighing on me, I found myself focusing more easily, staying later when projects needed extra attention. One evening, as I was finishing a set of reports, my director Michael Ortiz stopped by my desk. He glanced at the stack of papers and gave a small nod. "You've got an eye for detail," he said. "That kind of dedication doesn't go unnoticed." It was a short sentence, but it carried more warmth than any praise I'd heard at that dinner table. I smiled, thanked him, and when he walked away, I realized my hands were trembling not from nerves, but from the simple shock of being appreciated. The following weeks passed in a rhythm I had never known before. I woke early, ran along the river, worked hard, cooked meals that filled the apartment with the smell of herbs and butter. In the evenings I read or sat by the window with a cup of tea watching the city lights flicker across the water. Sometimes I caught my reflection in the glass and barely recognized the woman looking back. Still me, but steadier, more certain. The quiet that used to suffocate me had turned into something peaceful, a space I could finally rest in. It was during one of those quiet evenings that an email changed everything. The subject line was simple: Director of Financial Analysis, Seattle Opportunity. I clicked it open, expecting another networking pitch, but the message was from a recruiter at a fintech startup I had once admired from afar. They were expanding, she wrote, and someone on their team had recommended me. The position came with a salary nearly half again what I earned now, plus company shares and relocation assistance. I read it twice, then a third time the words steady and clear on the screen. I sat back in my chair, letting the thoughts settle. Moving would mean leaving Portland, the city that had held both my pain and my healing, but it would also mean stepping fully into a life built on my own choices. I thought of my parents' house, of the years I'd spent trying to keep it standing, and how small that world felt now compared to the one waiting just beyond. My heart was pounding as I picked up my phone and called my closest friend, Emily. When she answered, I told her everything. She didn't hesitate. "You have to take it," she said, laughing through the line. "This is your new beginning." The next morning, I wrote back with 2 words: I accept. I watched the cursor blink after I hit send, and for the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like something to endure. It felt like something to walk toward. The next few weeks became a blur of packing paperwork and long drives past familiar streets I had once called home. On my last evening in Portland, I stood on the bridge above the river where I used to run. The sky had turned pale gold, the city lights flickering awake below. I whispered a quiet goodbye, not out of sadness, but gratitude. That city had shaped me, but it no longer held me. When I arrived in Seattle, the air smelled of salt and rain, and the skyline rose sharp and glassy against the gray clouds. My new apartment was small, but the windows opened to the sound of the city's heartbeat. I placed my last box on the floor, sat by the window, and let the reality sink in. The life I had built in silence had brought me here to a place where every decision was my own. Outside, car lights moved along the wet streets, glowing like threads of fire, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, peace that didn't depend on anyone's approval. As I looked out over the skyline, I knew this was only the beginning. The years of quiet struggle were behind me, and what waited ahead was still unwritten, but it would be mine. Somewhere in the distance, the Space Needle glowed through the mist, steady and bright, a single point of light in the soft Seattle night. And for the first time, I felt ready to follow it, wherever it led next. 6 months after I arrived in Seattle, my life moved in rhythms I hadn't known before. Mornings began with coffee on the balcony, while the city shook itself awake beneath a gray sky. From the 16th floor, I could see the sound shimmer between buildings, the fairy lights flickering across the water. My days were long, but they belonged entirely to me. The startup where I worked had a pace that left little room for hesitation. New clients' deadlines, endless brainstorming sessions, but it also gave me something I'd been missing for years: purpose that came from within. My new role demanded precision and creativity. I managed a team that looked to me for answers, and somehow I always found them. The hours were heavy, but the recognition felt lighter than air. Every project brought new trust from my colleagues, and for the first time, my work was measured by results, not by anyone's shadow. My salary allowed me to save quickly, and I watched my account grow month after month until one evening when the balance finally crossed the number I had dreamed of for years. I closed my laptop and just sat there, the city glowing outside my window. The thought came quietly but firmly: it was time to find a place of my own. That weekend, I met with a real estate agent named Dana Porter, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes who carried her clipboard like a compass. We toured several apartments across the city, some sleek and cold, others cozy but dim. I wanted sunlight space to breathe a view that reminded me why I had chosen to start over. By late afternoon, we stepped into a new building near Queen Anne Hill. The elevator opened to a room washed in light floor-to-ceiling windows framing the skyline, and beyond it, the Space Needle rising steady against the sky. The floors gleamed pale oak, and the air smelled faintly of new paint and possibility. Dana turned to me with a small smile. "You'll know when it's yours," she said. I did. 2 weeks later, I stood in that same room holding the keys in my hand. The echo of my footsteps followed me as I walked from room to room, touching the walls, tracing the edges of my new life. I set my bag down and looked out at the city below, cars sliding through the streets, the late sun turning the windows gold. Everything in that moment felt quiet and solid. For years, I had given to hold on to something that was never mine, but this was built entirely from my own hands. The move took days, but each piece of furniture I placed felt like a sentence written in my own story. I chose a light gray sofa, a narrow oak table, and a tall bookshelf for the novels I had collected since college. On the wall, I hung a framed photograph of the river in Portland, taken on my last run before I left. It wasn't a goodbye, it was a reminder that I had survived, that I had carried every lesson forward. By the time the last box was unpacked, the apartment felt like a reflection of everything I had become: simple, quiet, unshakably mine. One evening, as the sunset spilled orange light across the glass, I took a picture from the balcony, the Space Needle shining in the distance, and posted it online with a short caption, "A New Beginning." It was meant to be nothing more than a small celebration. Minutes later, my phone buzzed. The message on the screen made my heart pause for a beat. It was from Lauren. "You're really something. Why didn't you tell the family?" There was no warmth in her words, only something sharp and measured, like she wasn't sure whether to be surprised or offended. I started to type a reply, then stopped. I turned the phone face down on the table and let the silence answer for me. For years, every accomplishment of mine had been folded into someone else's narrative, diminished until it disappeared. This one didn't need explaining. The photo and the keys on the counter said enough. That night, I poured a glass of wine, put on a soft jazz station, and sat by the window. The city lights blinked in the distance like they were breathing. I leaned back against the couch, letting the quiet settle around me, and for the first time the silence didn't ache. It soothed. The following weekend, as I was tidying up, my phone rang again this time, with a name I hadn't seen in months, Ruth Coleman. She'd been our neighbor across the street from my parents for as long as I could remember, a kind woman who always waved from her porch. Her voice was warm as ever, but I could hear hesitation behind it. "Nora, honey, how have you been?" she asked. I wasn't sure if I should call, but "There's something I thought you should see." Before I could respond, a message came through. It was a photo. Ruth cleared her throat on the line. "I just walked past your parents' house," she said quietly. "They put up a banner out front. It caught me off guard." I opened the image and felt the air leave my lungs. Across the porch hung a wide white banner, the letters printed in bold red, "Congratulations, Lauren, for preserving the family home." The words stared back at me like they were carved in stone. I sank into the nearest chair phone still in my hand. The light in my apartment suddenly felt too bright, the room too quiet. Ruth's voice wavered. "I'm so sorry, dear. I thought you should know." "Thank you," I managed barely above a whisper. We said goodbye, and the line went dead. For a long while I just sat there, unable to move. The picture on the screen blurred as my eyes filled not from surprise, but from the blunt weight of knowing exactly what it meant. The story had been rewritten again, and this time I had been erased completely. 3 years of sacrifices turned into a line of praise for someone who hadn't lifted a hand. The house I had quietly saved had become another stage for my sister's spotlight. The anger didn't come right away. It built slowly, like a fire taking hold under the surface. I thought of every late night spent sending money, of every "just this once" message I had believed. I remembered my father's denial at the table, my mother's cold silence, and the moment they had called me too sensitive. Now they had replaced me altogether. I stood and went to the small cabinet near the kitchen, pulling out the same folder I had carried from Portland, the one filled with proof. Page after page of bank statements, transfers, and messages. My hands trembled as I flipped through them, the ink crisp and certain. $72,000. Every dollar earned, sent, and forgotten. I traced the total with my finger, feeling the heat rising through my chest. They could hang a banner, they could tell whatever story they wanted, but I still had the truth, and I wouldn't let it vanish this time. That night I couldn't sleep. The city outside was alive, but my thoughts ran faster than the traffic below. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and began typing. I created a spreadsheet listing every payment from start to finish. The columns filled with dates, amounts, and notes, mortgage support payment for March, temporary help. Then I added a chart, the bars climbing steadily until the total stretched high across the screen. The number glowed there, undeniable $72,000. When the clock struck midnight, I printed each page and slid them into a new binder. The soft hum of the printer filled the apartment, steady and rhythmic, like the sound of something being built, not destroyed. I stacked the pages neatly, each one a piece of the story that had been stolen. By dawn, the first light was spilling through the windows. I stood at the balcony, binder in hand, watching the sky turn pale above the city. The cool air brushed my face, and in that quiet hour, I knew what I had to do. If they wanted to pretend my sacrifice never happened, I would remind them with facts, not arguments. They could rewrite the story as many times as they wanted, but this time I would have the last word. I placed the binder on the dining table beside my coffee mug, its weight solid and certain. The steam from the cup curled upward, catching the early light. Outside, the city woke again, unaware of the quiet resolve forming in a small apartment overlooking the skyline. Somewhere, a new story was waiting to be told, and I was ready to make sure the truth finally saw the light. The binder sat on my dining table for 2 days before I touched it again. Every time I passed by the sight of it reminded me that the truth was sitting quietly waiting for me to decide what to do next. The pages inside carried more than numbers. They carried every late night, every canceled plan, every part of myself I had given without thanks. I thought of the banner still hanging above my parents' porch and how it had turned my sacrifice into someone else's glory. The longer I stared at the binder, the clearer it became that silence would only let the lie grow louder. On the third night, my phone buzzed with a familiar name, Emily Carter, my cousin and one of the few relatives who still kept in touch. She didn't bother with small talk. Nora. "I think you should know," she said, her voice careful. "Your parents are planning a big family dinner next weekend. They're calling it an appreciation night." I paused, waiting for her to continue. "They asked me to put together the slideshow," she said softly. "It's all about the house, about how Lauren saved it." The way she said it told me she didn't believe a word of it. A quiet anger stirred inside me. "So they're doubling down," I said, trying to steady my voice. Emily sighed. "It's not fair, Nora. Everyone's going to be there, relatives from both sides. It's supposed to be a celebration, but it feels wrong." I thanked her for telling me and asked if she could send me a copy of the slideshow once she finished. There was a pause before she agreed. "Be careful," she said before hanging up. Her words lingered long after the call ended. That night I sat by the window with the city lights stretching out below. The reflection of my apartment glowed faintly in the glass, the binder still open on the table behind me. I knew what I had to do. For years I had built my life on the idea that staying quiet kept the peace, but all it had done was keep me invisible. This time I would speak in a language my parents couldn't twist or deny, facts, numbers, proof. The slideshow arrived 2 days later, a file attachment in Emily's email. I opened it carefully, half expecting my hands to shake. The first few slides were what I'd imagined photos of the house covered in snow, my parents smiling on the porch, Lauren standing in front with her arm around them. The captions read like a script, "Our family's legacy." "Thank you, Lauren, for your strength, preserving what matters most." Each line landed like a stone. When I reached the final slide, I took a deep breath and got to work. I duplicated the entire file and renamed it quietly, saving it to my own drive. Then I began to build something new. After the photo of the house faded, I added a blank white slide with bold text across the center. Financial contributions 2020-2023. Underneath, I inserted the chart I had made, the rising bars in muted blue and gray, each labeled by month. I added another slide below it filled with copies of my mother's old text messages. "Just this once. The bank is calling. Please help." Piece by piece, I laid the story bare. No emotion, no accusation, just evidence. At the end, I added one final slide, a photo of the house from last summer, and a single line of text beneath it. "This is what I gave. Don't forget it." I ran through the slideshow several times, adjusting the timing until it flowed as smoothly as the one Emily had made. When it was done, I saved it on a small silver flash drive and slipped it into a folder beside the binder. Over the next few days, I rehearsed how it might unfold. I imagined the moment my father would stand up with a microphone, proud and unbothered, telling everyone how Lauren had carried the family through hardship. I pictured the nods, the smiles, the clinking of glasses. Then I saw myself standing calm and quiet, walking toward the projector with steady hands. I wouldn't need to shout or defend. The numbers would do it for me. The night before the dinner, I barely slept. My mind replayed every conversation from the past 3 years, the desperate phone calls, the empty promises, the way my parents' eyes had turned away when I finally told the truth. The next morning, I woke before dawn, made a cup of coffee, and laid everything out on the table: the binder, the flash drive, and a single printed copy of my financial report. I stared at them until the sun began to rise, washing the apartment in pale light. Then I gathered everything into my bag, took one last look at the skyline outside my window, and left. The restaurant was in downtown Seattle, a place my parents loved for its view of the bay. When I arrived, the hall was already glowing with warm light and soft music. Through the glass doors, I could see the long table set with candles and flowers, the faces of relatives I hadn't seen in years. My father stood near the front, his suit pressed a microphone in his hand. My mother sat beside him smiling while Lauren greeted guests with practiced ease. I waited by the doorway as my father began to speak. His voice carried smoothly through the room. "We are so proud to be here tonight," he said. "Family means everything to us. And this home, our home, has stood because of dedication, perseverance, and love, especially from our daughter Lauren." Applause followed. Cameras flashed. My sister looked radiant under the lights, and for a moment no one noticed me at all. When the slideshow began, I slipped quietly to the back of the room, my pulse steady. The photos rolled one after another: the house in winter, my parents' anniversary dinner, the smiling faces everyone expected to see. Then came the final slide Emily had created: "Thank you, Lauren, for preserving our family home." The audience clapped again, and my father raised his glass. That was my cue. I stepped forward, heels clicking against the polished floor. The sound turned heads one by one until the room fell silent. I stopped beside the projector, met my father's eyes, and spoke clearly. "If the truth embarrasses you," I said, "that isn't my fault." Before anyone could respond, I connected my flash drive and switched the presentation. The screen flickered, then turned white. Words appeared across it in black letters: "Financial Contributions 2020-2023. The room froze. Then the charts came up, month after month of payments, each labeled with a date and amount. My mother's text messages followed her pleas for help, her promises to pay me back. Gasps rippled through the room. My father's expression tightened, his hand gripping the edge of the table. Lauren's face went pale. I turned toward them, my voice steady. 3 years, $72,000. Without that money, this house would have been gone. You know it, and I know it. But you chose silence. The murmurs grew louder. A few relatives whispered to each other, glancing between the screen and my parents. My father started to speak, but the words caught in his throat. My mother looked down, eyes wet, her hands trembling in her lap. I pointed at the final slide, the photo of the house, my own words beneath it. "This is the truth. This is the person who kept it standing. No one can deny it." For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the projector. Then softly, someone began to clap. Another joined in, then another. The applause spread through the room until it filled every corner. I didn't stay to watch what came next. I closed my laptop, slipped the flash drive into my bag, and turned toward the door. As I walked past the tables, I could feel eyes following me, some stunned, some admiring, some full of questions. Behind me, I heard my mother call my name, her voice breaking, but I didn't stop. I reached the door, stepped into the cool night air, and let it wash over me. The sky above the bay was deep blue, scattered with faint stars. The noise from inside faded until all I could hear was the quiet rhythm of the waves beyond the pier. I drew a long breath, my chest rising and falling with the release of something I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. The truth was out. The story could no longer be rewritten. As I walked to my car, the reflection of the restaurant lights shimmered on the wet pavement. I looked once more through the window, my parents sitting frozen beneath the screen. My sister bowed over her hands. Then I turned away, started the engine, and drove into the dark, knowing that whatever came next, I would never again be invisible. And somewhere inside that quiet certainty, I could already feel the first traces of freedom beginning to take shape. 2 days after the dinner, a quiet knock echoed through my apartment. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I looked through the peephole, my heart tightened. My parents stood in the hallway, side by side, carrying the same uneasy stillness that had filled the restaurant the night I walked out. My mother's eyes were swollen, her face pale beneath the hallway light. My father looked smaller somehow, the usual authority in his shoulders replaced by something tired. I hesitated before opening the door, but I did. They stepped inside carefully, as if crossing into someone else's world. The air in my apartment felt sharper around them, tidy bright and entirely mine. My mother took in the space slowly, her hands clasped in front of her. "You've made a lovely home, Nora," she said, her voice thin. My father only nodded. The silence between us stretched like a line neither of us wanted to touch. Finally, my mother spoke again. "We came to apologize." I didn't move. She reached into her purse, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and held it toward me. "We talked after that night," she said softly. "Your father and I both know we were wrong. We let you bear everything alone. We didn't realize how much you gave until it was too late. We want to make it right." Her voice cracked. "We're adding your name to the house deed. You deserve that much." For a moment, I just looked at the paper in her hand. It should have felt like a victory, the validation I'd wanted for years. But instead, all I felt was calm, steady, unshaken. I shook my head slowly. "You don't have to do that," I said. My father looked up, then his brow furrowing. "Nora, it's the least we can do," he said. "It's your right. You earned it." I met his eyes and spoke quietly. "I have a home now, Dad. My name is already on this one." My mother's lips trembled. "But that's different," she said. "That house is part of our family history. It's where you grew up." I took a breath. "It's also where I learned to disappear." The room went still again. My father looked down at the floor, his voice rough when he finally spoke. "We thought we were doing our best," he said. "We thought we were treating both of you fairly." I nodded once. "I know you believed that. But fairness isn't just about money or names on paper. It's about respect, and you never gave me that until I forced you to see it." My mother's eyes filled again, tears sliding down her cheeks. "We were proud of you," she whispered. "We just didn't know how to say it. I wished those words had come years earlier, but I also knew they wouldn't change what was already behind us. You don't have to say it now," I told her. "I'm not angry anymore. I just can't go back to living for your approval." She nodded faintly, pressing the tissue to her face. My father cleared his throat and looked around the apartment again, the framed landscape from Portland, the small plants near the window, the simple order of a life built without their help. "You've done well," he said finally. "Better than we imagined." I poured 3 glasses of water and handed them each one. None of us spoke for a while. The city hummed softly outside, the faint sound of traffic drifting through the glass. When they finally stood to leave, my mother touched my hand briefly. "We'll take down the banner," she said, "and we'll tell everyone the truth." I didn't answer, but I gave her a small nod. After the door closed behind them, I leaned against it and let the silence settle again. My apartment felt warm and peaceful, untouched by the ghosts that had stood in it moments before. The paper they had brought lay on the counter still folded. I picked it up, looked at it once more, and slipped it into the drawer beneath the sink, not out of bitterness, but because I no longer needed proof. Over the next week, messages began to arrive. A few relatives reached out, some apologizing, some trying to make sense of what had happened at the dinner. I kept my responses brief and polite. Emily called one evening, her voice full of disbelief. "They're actually telling everyone the truth," she said. "Your father even called Uncle Ray to explain. He said he's ashamed of how they treated you." I listened quietly, the words settling somewhere deep inside me. Shame couldn't erase the past, but acknowledgement mattered. At work, life moved forward. My team congratulated me on a successful project, and my supervisor mentioned the possibility of a promotion later that year. Each day felt like a small step towards something steady and self-defined. I met new friends, joined a weekend running group, and began to see the city not as an escape, but as home. The view from my balcony changed with the seasons, sunsets fading into rain, rain into fog, but the peace beneath it stayed. One evening as I was tidying up after dinner, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Lauren. Her words were brief. "I'm sorry for everything. I didn't know the whole story. I hope we can talk someday." I stared at the screen for a while before setting it down. I wasn't ready to reply, but for the first time the thought didn't carry bitterness. Maybe one day we would find the right words, just not now. That night I sat by the window watching the city lights shimmer across the glass. I thought of the long road that had brought me here, the quiet years of giving the storm that had finally broken the silence that had turned into strength. The truth had cost me my old family ties, but it had given me something far more solid, the certainty of who I was, without anyone else's approval. As the clock neared midnight, I turned off the lamp and stepped out onto the balcony. The air was cool, carrying the faint sound of waves from the bay. Below, the streets glowed gold under the streetlights, and somewhere far off, the ferry horn echoed through the night. I wrapped my hands around the railing and closed my eyes. The wind brushed against my face, steady and kind. Behind me, the apartment stood still, the life I had built, one decision at a time, free from old debts and invisible expectations. I thought of the years I'd spent trying to earn a place in someone else's story, and how I'd finally learned to write my own. When I opened my eyes again, the horizon was clear. The city stretched wide and bright beneath the stars, the Space Needle glowing like a promise. I took a deep breath and whispered to the quiet air, not for anyone to hear, but for myself. This is mine, all of it. And for the first time in a long time, the words felt entirely true. The past had finally released its grip, leaving room for something new, something I was ready to begin. The weeks that followed brought a kind of stillness I hadn't known before. The chaos had passed, the truth had settled, and life began to move forward quietly. At work, the promotion Michael had hinted at became official. My new title, Director of Financial Analysis, appeared on the company website one Monday morning without fanfare. Still, when I saw it, a wave of quiet pride rose through me. It wasn't about the salary increase or the corner office. It was about the sense that every choice I'd made, every moment I'd stood alone, had finally led somewhere solid. My days filled with steady rhythm again. Early mornings with coffee and the hum of the city outside my window. Evenings spent on the balcony, the lights of Seattle shimmering across the water. The binder that once sat on my dining table was now tucked away in a drawer, not forgotten but no longer needed. Its purpose had been fulfilled. The truth had spoken for itself, and the world had adjusted around it. Then one afternoon I received an email from a nonprofit I had donated to in the past, an organization supporting women in financial literacy. They were hosting a mentorship workshop in the city and were looking for professionals to speak about personal finance and empowerment. The message ended with a simple line, "We think your story could make a difference." I read it twice before closing my laptop. For years, my story had been a private wound. The thought of sharing it publicly made me pause, but the more I sat with it, the more I felt something shift inside me. Maybe it was time for that story to do some good. A week later, I stood at the front of a small conference room filled with women of every age, students, mothers, retirees. The room smelled faintly of coffee and dry erase markers, and a soft buzz of conversation filled the air. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't use notes. I talked about balance sheets and savings plans, about how every decision counts, even when no one notices. Then I told them something I'd never said aloud before, that sometimes the hardest part of managing money isn't the math, but the boundaries it requires. I saw nods around the room, small glimmers of recognition in strangers' eyes. Afterward, a woman about my mother's age approached me. She introduced herself as Carol. Her hands shook a little as she spoke. "I wish I'd heard that 20 years ago," she said quietly. I spent my life helping everyone else until there was nothing left for me. I reached out and took her hand. It's never too late to start keeping something for yourself, I told her. She smiled, tears bright in her eyes, and thanked me. When she left, I sat for a while in the empty room, the chairs lined up neatly, sunlight spilling through the blinds. It felt like something inside me had finally turned from pain into purpose. That evening, as I walked home through the city, I thought about how much had changed since that first night in Portland when I canceled the automatic payments. I remembered the fear, the guilt, the weight of thinking I had betrayed my family by choosing myself. But standing there now, watching the lights reflect on the water, I knew I had simply begun to live honestly. The thought brought a calm I hadn't felt in years. A few days later, I received a call from Emily. "I wanted to tell you," she said, "your parents finally told the rest of the family the truth. They even called Grandma's side last weekend. Everyone knows now that it was you who kept the house." I didn't know what to say for a moment. She hesitated before adding, "They're trying, Nora. Slowly, but they're trying." I thanked her and promised to stay in touch. After the call ended, I sat by the window, watching a plane cut through the clouds above the skyline. For the first time, I felt no bitterness, just distance and peace. That weekend, I drove out to a quiet viewpoint overlooking the bay, a place I'd discovered on one of my long runs. The wind was brisk, the air faintly salted from the water. I thought of my parents back in Oregon, of Lauren somewhere rebuilding her own life. I wondered if in their own way they had begun to understand what I'd been fighting for, not money, not recognition, but simple acknowledgement that my worth was my own. When I got back home, a small envelope waited in my mailbox. The handwriting on the front was familiar, my father's. Inside was a short letter written in his careful script. "We took the banner down a long time ago," it read. "The house feels quieter now, but maybe that's how it's supposed to be. We're proud of you, Nora, truly proud." There was no return address, no signature beyond their names at the bottom, but it was enough. I placed the letter in the same drawer as the binder, side by side, one representing the fight and the other its closure. A few weeks later, I was invited back to the nonprofit for another workshop. This time, instead of teaching finance, they asked if I would mentor a small group of young women just starting their careers. I said yes without hesitation. Every Wednesday evening, we met in a small office overlooking the harbor. We talked about salaries, debt savings, but also about courage, about how to stand firm when people expect you to shrink. I saw pieces of myself in each of them, quiet strength, waiting to be recognized. One night after class, as I locked up Carol, the woman from the first workshop appeared at the door again. She carried a small envelope. "I wanted you to have this," she said. Inside was a handwritten note that read, "Because you reminded me that it's okay to start over." Tucked inside was a single daisy pressed between two sheets of paper. I looked up and she smiled. "I opened my own account," she said. "For the first time in my life, I'm saving for myself." She laughed softly. "It's not much yet, but it's mine." After she left, I held that daisy in my hand and felt tears sting my eyes. Not from sadness, but from the quiet realization that everything I had endured now had meaning beyond me. The sacrifices, the silence, even the public confrontation, all of it had built something stronger than revenge. It had built understanding. Later that night, I placed the daisy in a small glass by the window. The petals caught the last traces of light before dusk fell, turning them gold. I thought about how not long ago I had stood in a crowded restaurant with everyone's eyes on me, trembling but unbroken. Now I stood in my own apartment surrounded by peace that I had built with my own hands. The contrast felt like a deep exhale after years of holding my breath. As the city lights flickered on one by one, I stepped onto the balcony and looked out across the skyline. The Space Needle gleamed through the clouds, steady as ever, a reminder of how far I'd come. Behind me, the daisy glowed faintly in the lamplight, its shadow stretching across the table. I knew the hardest parts of the story were behind me, and what lay ahead was finally mine to write. Somewhere deep inside, I understood that justice had already been served, not through punishment, but through peace. And as the night deepened over Seattle, I realized that the life I was living now was the truest proof of all. The next morning, when the first light touched the city, I woke to a soft knock at the door, a sound that would mark the beginning of one final chapter I never expected. When I opened the door that morning, the knock was soft enough that I almost thought I imagined it. On the other side stood Lauren holding a paper bag and looking more like the sister I remembered than the woman who'd stood beside my parents that night at the restaurant. The years of tension seemed to fall away as she smiled nervously and asked if she could come in. I stepped aside without a word, and for a moment the quiet between us said more than anything we could have rehearsed. She set the bag on the counter and took a deep breath. "I baked these," she said, pulling out a small box of lemon muffins. I didn't know what else to bring. The scent filled the kitchen, warm, tart, familiar. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "You probably don't even like these anymore." I smiled a little. "Still do." We sat at the table, the same one where I had spread out the binder months earlier. She looked down at her hands before speaking. "I watched your presentation that night. I didn't realize how much you'd done. I was so wrapped up in trying to be perfect that I didn't notice who was actually holding everything together." Her voice cracked. "You didn't deserve how they treated you, and you didn't deserve how I treated you either." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, the morning light filtered through the windows, soft and golden. I could see how much she meant it. "Thank you," I said quietly. "That means more than you think." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "I've started therapy," she said. "Mom's going too. They're trying in their own way." We talked for nearly an hour about ordinary things, at first the weather, her job, the city, then about everything that had broken and what might still be mended. There were no promises, no guarantees, just a small thread of honesty that felt stronger than anything we'd managed before. When she finally stood to leave, she hugged me gently and whispered, "I hope this is a beginning." I nodded, holding on for just a second longer before letting her go. After she left, I carried the muffins to the balcony and sat in the morning sun. The city was waking up, boats gliding across the bay, buses rumbling in the distance, the low hum of life carrying on. I took a bite of one muffin, the flavor instantly pulling me back to simpler times before comparison had turned into competition. It wasn't forgiveness yet, not fully, but it was a step toward peace. Over the next few weeks, I kept busy with work and the mentorship group. Each session brought new faces, new stories, and new reminders that struggle isn't what defines us, it's how we rise from it. The women I mentored began to open up about their own families, their fears of being overlooked or undervalued. I shared what I could without bitterness, focusing on the lessons hidden inside the hurt, how boundaries protect love, how truth, no matter how painful, always leads to freedom. One evening, after a long day at the office, I received a message from Carol, the woman who had once handed me the daisy. She wrote simply, "Still saving, still learning. Thank you." That single sentence felt like a quiet echo of everything this journey had been about. Not revenge, not even recognition, but transformation. What began as a fight for fairness had turned into a reminder that change, real change, often starts with one act of courage. As spring turned to summer, I took a short trip back to Oregon. Not to the family house, I wasn't ready for that, but to the small park down the street from it. The same park where Lauren and I had played as kids, where the air always smelled faintly of cedar and rain. The swings were still there, the trees a little taller, the grass worn in the same spots. I sat on the bench near the edge of the path and watched the light fade over the horizon. It struck me then how much life can shift without fanfare. How sometimes justice doesn't roar, it arrives quietly in the form of peace that finally feels earned. My parents had faced their own reckoning not through punishment, but through the mirror of truth, and I had found my footing not in their approval but in my own steadiness. When I returned to Seattle, I framed that daisy between glass and hung it near my desk. It wasn't much to look at, just a small white flower pressed flat, but every time I saw it, I remembered what it meant that even after years of silence and shadow, something can still bloom. Now when I walk through my apartment, the one built from my own effort and patience, I see traces of that journey everywhere. The binder tucked away in the drawer, the letter from my parents folded neatly beside it. The city lights that once felt foreign and now feel like home. The scars of that old story haven't vanished, but they've softened, becoming part of who I am instead of what holds me back. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that justice doesn't always look like a victory. It looks like reclaiming your peace, your dignity, and your sense of self after being told you were less. It's learning that respect is worth more than belonging and that silence has a cost no one should pay forever. So if you're listening to this and you've ever been made to feel invisible, I hope my story reminds you that your worth isn't up for debate. You don't need anyone's permission to live fully or to stand in your own light. Thank you for listening. And if this story touched something in you, take a moment to share it with someone who needs to hear that they too are enough just as they are.